A 20-liter plastic container holds exactly 16 kilograms of diesel fuel. On Tuesday, June 2, 2026, this precise volume became the maximum daily allowance for any civilian vehicle on the Crimean Peninsula. A line of cars stretching 950 meters outside a petrol station in Simferopol stalled next to dry pumps, while less than 40 kilometers away, a mechanized Army Corps required 300 tons of fuel per day just to maintain static readiness. The geography of an entire military theater collapsed into a single administrative restriction: take 20 liters or leave it. To understand how a centralized military apparatus lost control of its own domestic supply lines, one must look at the physical geometry of the land. Crimea is an island in everything but name. For 2 years, the public focus remained fixed on the 19-kilometer Crimean bridge spanning the Kerch Strait. Yet, a hidden structural vulnerability dictated Russian military logistics. Moscow banned the transport of bulk fuel tankers across the bridge structure after the explosions of previous years. The entire garrison, the fleet, and the civilian population became completely dependent on a single terrestrial artery. The R-280 highway, renamed the Novorossiya Highway by administrative decree, runs 380 kilometers from Rostov-on-Don through the occupied plains of southern Ukraine down to the heart of the peninsula. This strip of asphalt, exactly 9 meters wide in most sections, acts as the singular high-pressure pipe feeding the entire southern grouping of the Russian armed forces. It carries the food, the artillery shells, and crucially, the refined petroleum required to run thousands of armored vehicles. The system functioned perfectly as long as the territory behind the front lines remained an abstract safety zone. That safety depended on a traditional military axiom: distance equals protection. Refineries like the Iltsevsky facility in the Krasnodar region were constructed over 800 kilometers from Ukrainian territory on the assumption that no tactical weapon could bridge the gap in meaningful numbers. That geographic insulation dissolved in a single season. The weapon that broke the system is not a multi-million-dollar cruise missile requiring strategic bombers to launch. It is an uncrewed aerial vehicle with a wingspan of less than 3 meters, constructed from carbon fiber and commercial electronics during the final week of May 2026. The Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces deployed a new operational doctrine through the 412th Nemesis Brigade. They introduced a specialized low-altitude drone known as the Hornet. This platform carries a 5-kilogram shaped charge warhead and operates via edge computing machine vision. It does not require a continuous radio link with a human operator, making the heavy Russian electronic warfare complexes along the R-280 highway completely obsolete. The drone's onboard processor identifies the distinct thermal and visual silhouette of a fuel tanker, locks its trajectory, and impacts the unarmored cargo tank at 140 kilometers per hour. The structural math of this engagement is devastating. A single standard fuel truck carries 30,000 liters of fuel, representing an asset value, including the heavy vehicle and its cargo, exceeding $200,000. The autonomous drone that destroys it costs less than $7,000 to manufacture. When this asymmetry is multiplied by dozens of strikes every night, the logistics network experiences what planners call systemic exhaustion. You cannot replace specialized heavy logistics drivers and heavy trucks at the velocity they are being eliminated. This process marks the definitive end of the 2023 warfare model. In that summer, mechanized brigades threw Western armor directly against multi-layered minefields and reinforced trench lines, resulting in gains measured in hundreds of meters at a catastrophic cost in human lives. The 2026 campaign has inverted this approach. Rather than attacking the wall, the strategy targets the physical fluid that allows the wall to move. Without diesel, a 60-ton main battle tank becomes an immobile piece of salvaged iron. and an advanced air defense radar runs out of generator power in less than 12 hours. The official administrative response followed a predictable pattern of systemic denial. The Moscow-appointed governor of Sevastopol announced that the fuel deficit was a temporary logistical anomaly and urged the population to avoid panic. However, internal communications within the occupation administration revealed a different reality. One official broke protocol by comparing the current isolation of the peninsula to the historical siege of Leningrad. While the propaganda framing is deliberately hyperbolic, the structural admission is precise. The land corridor has been severed into isolated, non-functioning segments. The pressure is expanding past the operational zone into the core financial structures of the state. The Russian Ministry of Economy silently revised its annual growth forecast for 2026 down to just 0.4%, a collapse from the previous estimate of 1.3%. Gross domestic product actually contracted during the first quarter of the year for the first time since the mobilization economy began in 2023. The state budget is entering its fifth consecutive year of structural deficit, with the funding gap widening into trillions of rubles. To slow the bleeding, the federal government raised the value-added tax from 20 to 22%, directly targeting the purchasing power of ordinary citizens to sustain the defense balance sheet. The entire economic engine of the state is designed to convert extracted crude oil into military expenditure. But that formula requires the internal processing infrastructure to remain intact. On the night of June 1st, a mass deployment of 148 drones saturated the airspace across western Russia, striking the Ilsky and Krasnodar refining complexes simultaneously. The primary revenue source for the war is burning at the exact moment the state treasury has warned the presidency that current military expenditures have crossed the threshold of long-term sustainability. The system is no longer absorbing the pressure. It is beginning to deform under it. The kinetic disruption of a single highway creates an immediate vertical pressure wave through an administrative architecture. When the R280 highway became a burning corridor, the Russian military command attempted to execute a standard textbook pivot, shifting the entire logistical load from asphalt to iron. Rail transport possesses an immense volumetric advantage, but it operates under absolute physical constraints. A standard fuel train consists of 54 cisterns, carrying 3,200 tons of petroleum products. It cannot swerve, it cannot hide, and its route is hard-coded into the geography of the Earth. The Dzhankoy railway junction in northern Crimea became the immediate bottleneck. By forcing thousands of tons of fuel through a single rail yard, the administration created a radar-conspicuous target that could be seen from low Earth orbit. On the night of June 2nd, coordinated strikes using modified commercial drones did not hit the trains themselves. They targeted the electrical substations feeding the overhead lines. The locomotives stopped moving. Within 12 hours, 32,000 tons of military and civilian fuel were stranded on static tracks, turning a solution into a high explosive liability. This logistical stagnation triggered an immediate triage protocol within the Kremlin. The Ministry of Defense issued Secret Directive 142, establishing a rigid hierarchy of consumption. The first tier belonged exclusively to frontline combat units and regional air defense systems. The second tier went to internal security forces tasked with preventing civilian unrest. The final tier, which received 0% of the remaining allocation, was civilian commerce and agriculture. The economic cost of this triage hit the southern occupied territories within 48 hours. The agricultural sector of Crimea and southern Kherson requires 45,000 tons of diesel fuel every June to power mechanized harvesters. Without this fuel, the machinery remained parked in storage sheds while thousands of hectares of winter wheat began to rot in the fields. The loss of the harvest caused an immediate 65% spike in local food prices, transforming a fuel shortage into a structural supply crisis. To stabilize the domestic market and stop the accelerating panic, Moscow implemented an absolute ban on the export of all refined petroleum products to international buyers. The political objective was to force domestic oil companies to saturate the internal market. The economic consequence was a direct, catastrophic hit to the state treasury. The export ban instantly choked off $42 million per day in hard foreign currency inflows, with foreign revenue streams drying up. The Russian ruble broke through the psychological threshold of 112 rubles per US dollar on the Moscow exchange. To prevent a total run on the banking sector, the central bank was forced to execute an emergency intervention, raising the key interest rate to 24%. This move successfully halted the immediate currency collapse, but it effectively terminated domestic commercial credit. The financial freeze landed directly on the damaged energy infrastructure. Refineries hit by the long-range drone strikes, including the Ilsky facility, found themselves unable to secure local bank loans to fund repairs. The specialized fractionation columns required to process crude oil into diesel cannot be manufactured domestically. They must be smuggled through complex sanctions evasion networks in East Asia at a 300% price premium. Without cash and without credit, the damaged refining units remained dark, permanently reducing the country's total refining capacity by an additional 2.8% every week, at the local level inside Crimea. This systemic starvation converted directly into social decomposition. Regimental logistics officers, facing worthless ruble salaries and hyperinflation in food prices, began siphoning fuel directly from the fuel tanks of inactive T-72 battle tanks and armored personnel carriers. This stolen fuel was funneled directly into a rapidly expanding civilian black market. A single liter of diesel in the suburbs of Sevastopol reached 480 rubles, more than 8 times the official price cap set by the state. When combat vehicles were ordered to rotate positions on June 3rd, an internal inspection revealed that 22% of the armored reserve in the sector lacked the fuel required to start their engines. The state security apparatus responded with immediate structural violence. The Federal Security Service deployed specialized counterintelligence units to the peninsula, arresting 19 senior logistics officers and court-martialing 2 base commanders within 48 hours, instead of restoring order. The purges triggered total administrative paralysis. Remaining logistical officers, terrified of signing any document that might later be construed as sabotage or corruption, refused to authorize any fuel movements without direct, written confirmation from the highest levels of the military district command in Rostov-on-Don. A distribution system that previously required 90 minutes to authorize a fuel transfer became bogged down in a bureaucratic labyrinth lasting up to 6 days. The final failure mechanism broke through the military grid itself on the morning of June 4th. The sophisticated S-400 anti-aircraft missile batteries protecting the main naval infrastructure at Sevastopol rely on mobile generators for their primary electrical power when the civilian grid experiences fluctuations. Because the specific synthetic lubricating oil and high-grade diesel required for these generators had been diverted or stolen, 3 separate radar units went offline simultaneously during an active airspace alert. The system did not suffer a single clean strike that ended its functionality. It experienced a cascading structural failure where every defensive measure implemented by the state actively accelerated the destruction of the layer beneath it. The lines on the military maps shown on international news broadcasts remained entirely unchanged, but the physical framework holding those lines in place had dropped past its ultimate tensile strength. The engine was still running, but the oil pan had been emptied, and the metal components were beginning to weld themselves together from the heat. By noon on June 4, 2026, the operational paralysis of the Crimean garrison transformed from a localized military deficit into a geopolitical realignment. The Black Sea Fleet, or what remains of its surface combatants inside Sevastopol harbor, has ceased to function as a power projection mechanism. Naval vessels require specific marine gas oil to run their propulsion turbines. Because the distribution nodes are dry, 6 guided missile corvettes remain tethered to their concrete berths, serving as static anti-aircraft batteries rather than mobile platforms. The maritime exclusion zone previously enforced by Moscow has effectively vanished, opening the western Black Sea to unescorted commercial shipping channels that bypass Russian jurisdiction entirely. The Kremlin's response arrived 72 hours behind the velocity of the crisis. On the afternoon of June 4th, the State Council announced the creation of an extraordinary logistics directorate, ordering the immediate requisition of civilian commercial fuel fleets from western Siberia. The plan dictates the transport of fuel via the Volga-Don canal system, using shallow draft river tankers. This administrative decision ignores basic physical geography. The canal infrastructure possesses a maximum annual throughput capacity that can handle less than 12% of the Southern Army's combined civilian and military requirements. Furthermore, the locks along the Volga-Don Canal are fixed, unarmored concrete structures, presenting a clear target for the same long-range aerial vectors that dismantled the Krasnodar refineries. The disruption of the refining sector has triggered an irreversible feedback loop inside the domestic oil industry. Because the Ilsky, Krasnodar, and neighboring Tuapse refineries are non-operational, regional crude oil storage tanks reached their absolute physical volumetric limits within 96 hours. Russia lacks the strategic storage capacity of Western nations. Its system relies on continuous processing and immediate export. When storage tanks fill, the pressure forces operators to choke production at the extraction wells in the Yamal-Nenets region, thousands of kilometers to the north. Stopping a permafrost extraction well is not a reversible administrative action. The intense cold causes the heavy paraffin fractions within the stagnant crude oil to solidify inside the wellbore, permanently destroying the hydraulic conductivity of the geological formation. Moscow is not just losing fuel for the current campaign, it is systematically destroying its core industrial architecture. The social cost of this structural decay is borne entirely by the 2 million civilians remaining on the peninsula. By the evening of June 4th, the currency-based retail economy inside Simferopol and Yalta had dissolved into a primitive resource barter system. Municipal water pumping stations, which rely on auxiliary diesel generators to maintain pressure during routine grid failures, stopped operating across 12 administrative districts. Pharmacies ran out of refrigerated insulin and antibiotics because the local cold chain logistics network collapsed from a total lack of fuel. The Moscow-appointed administration attempted to enforce a curfew using internal security troops, but these forces are restricted by the same 20-liter daily fuel ration, limiting their operational radius to the immediate vicinity of their urban barracks. This domestic degradation has completely stripped the Russian diplomatic delegation of its primary leverage at the ongoing negotiations in Geneva. The state's foundational demand, the permanent international recognition of Crimea as sovereign Russian territory, has been invalidated by the physical reality on the ground. A state cannot project sovereign authority over a territory it can neither fuel, feed, nor defend from systematic asymmetric interdiction. The Western and Ukrainian delegations have shifted their posture from containment to managed exhaustion, recognizing that every day the logistics lockdown continues, the material value of the occupied zone drops towards zero, transforming a strategic asset into an unsustainable financial liability for the Kremlin to avert an immediate military collapse before the onset of summer. The Russian General Staff has initiated a desperate redistribution of its remaining strategic reserves. Rail convoys carrying fuel and spare parts, originally allocated to the Eastern Military District along the Chinese border, have been systematically diverted toward European Russia. This relocation has created an immediate security vacuum across 5,000 kilometers of the Siberian frontier, leaving advanced radar installations and border outposts without operational depth or mechanical resupply. The state is actively cannibalizing its long-term territorial security to maintain an unstable, short-term presence on the Black Sea. The structural crisis unfolding across the South is not a temporary oscillation of wartime fortune. It is the manifestation of an absolute thermodynamic limit. An industrialized mass army cannot operate on a broken balance sheet when its energy infrastructure burns faster than it can be repaired. The recovery plans proposed by the state are mathematically insufficient to match the velocity of the drone-driven degradation. The lines on the map may remain static for weeks or months, but the physical framework beneath those lines has transitioned into a state of irreversible entropy. The campaign to decide the fate of the region did not end with a dramatic breakthrough. It is ending now, quietly, in the permanent freezing of the infrastructure that made occupation possible.